I'm Lisa Vatsky. I'm the Director of Multifamily Housing and Community Facilities at the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. Thank you for joining this meeting. This meeting is to discuss our bond allocation, bond cap allocation, 4% tax credit program long-term strategies. We have several staff on the call with us today: Claire Petersky, Jason Hennigan, Kate Held, Sojung Choi, Dan Rothman. Let's see, who else am I seeing? Tanya Scratchley, Eli Lieberman. Did I mention Bob Peterson? Bob Peterson. So thank you all for joining us. Please use the chat function. I will pause at times during the presentation to open it up for discussion, but I'd like to kind of get through the kind of key overall values and outcomes. I'll pause there and then we'll go through the process flow. I'll pause there and then we have a couple of items for discussion that I hope to open it up. But please don't hesitate to interrupt through the chat if you have questions that pop up, and then we'll get to those when we pause for conversation. So next slide. So the point of this presentation today is to talk about 2022 and beyond and reorienting for the values and outcomes that we're articulating now. So we've really are going through a process of resetting, reestablishing outcomes, having specific outcomes and targets that we're trying to achieve, and then basically grounding us in what is it that we want to achieve, and then implementing a whole new process to get us there. And as I mentioned, we'll have a couple of discussion points, and then we'll talk about next steps. So the commission, one more. Keep on that one for a moment. Thanks. The commission created criteria for evaluating projects in this program when it was non-competitive, in a non-competitive environment, and to achieve a minimum score. When we established the system, the goal was to gain and incentivize additional public benefit from the projects that were being financed. As demand began to exceed resources, we adjusted the criteria here and there, and actually are up to 24 different point criteria in the current framework. But now we've committed to reevaluating the entire process, prioritizing and creating predictability for specific articulated value-based outcomes, which is what we'll share today, and building a system to help achieve those results. And as the case is, whenever resources are limited, we will be making trade-offs to achieve these priorities. We recognize and want to acknowledge that the Commission and the Bond 4% tax credit program have benefited from a broad, long-standing group of developers, and that through these partnerships together, we have successfully built thousands of units in Washington. Although we are resetting the process, the world has changed, and our times call for a shift in focus. We do want to do it in a way that tries to minimize disruption of the current pipeline, provides predictability, and compares like projects. We want to maintain cost management and bond cap efficiency principles throughout the whole system. And we intend to maintain the basic tenets of financing housing that is well located, serving low incomes and target populations not served by the market for the longest period possible. However, we are now prioritizing the following values, which will guide any policy changes for the next 2 years. We'll start to walk through those values, and I'll talk a little bit about the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and then the methodology, the trade-offs and methodology for achieving those. Okay, next slide, Sojung. So value number one, racial justice and equity. We will, our outcome is to achieve greater equity and social justice for historically disenfranchised people. We will finance more development projects by organizations led by people of color for communities of color and areas of current or historic displacement with a more inclusionary approach and with development features that benefit the residents of color in the housing that is being created. We realize that there's a trade-off, and we will need to work collaboratively to identify and dismantle systematic barriers to deploy capacity building and technical assistance along with this priority to be successful. We recognize that there has clearly been a systematic disadvantage to communities of color in the housing development and finance arena, and we are committed to addressing the inequalities and unintended consequences that our approach to allocating resources have created. We will make changes to our programs that prioritize development by and for communities of color. Across the state, we will prioritize projects sponsored by organizations with a broad majority and ED or CEO of color, place-based, and further prioritize service to specific populations based on local community needs and resources. And for this, in order to implement this, we will provide a continuum of options for organizations to deliver and achieve a by and for community-based approach through specific point criteria. Okay, next value. Alignment of resources. The Commission acts in coordination with other public funders to help them achieve their federal, state, local, and state and local goals, and to create a predictable path for developers and our funding partners, resulting in a more efficient use of public funds. That is our outcome. In terms of trade-offs, we know that the level of public resources is varied throughout the state, and in some cases, projects may be feasible without any public resources. By prioritizing projects with public funds, we may disadvantage communities where the public resources do not fund these types of projects or uses public resources for other types of housing. But key resources at the local, state, and federal levels create and preserve affordable housing. Many of these resources rely on the bond 4% tax credit program to complete the financing stack. These public funds or contribution to land are a proxy for priorities either driven by the local jurisdiction or by the state legislative process and represent important community needs in the state. In terms of methodology and how we will implement this, we will compare like projects and develop threshold minimum amounts to be considered as part of this bucket. So we will adjust for Seattle, King, and Balance Estate in terms of what's required for public leverage to be in these, to be compared to like projects. And we will target 50 to 60% of the resources to projects with public funding commitments. Next value. Meeting affordable housing needs everywhere and geographic balance. In terms of outcomes, the Bond 4% tax credit program is a statewide resource. As such, the Commission has the responsibility to ensure reasonable levels of geographic distribution and dispersion across the state. Given that this is a debt program, the market economics, rent levels, and costs to develop are not equally viable throughout the state. The Commission wants to facilitate developers accessing the Bond 4% program in as many locations across the state as is feasible and avoid overconcentration in one area at the expense of others. The trade-off may be that we allocate less bonds and tax credits to projects in the Seattle-King County area. Over the years, the market and economics have largely determined the location of bond tax credit projects. In this most competitive recent environment, projects outside of King County, most notably new construction projects, have had difficulty competing. This has led to an increasingly large share of the resources flowing to King County, especially Seattle. And we want to ensure that projects outside of King County can continue to access this program and want to look at additional locations that could use this resource, especially with the recent change to establish the 4% tax credit floor. Given the demand, local resources, and existing pipeline in Seattle-King County, we want to try to create a predictable path for everyone and ensure a broader distribution. Because achievable rents are similar in Snohomish County as King, and because Snohomish County has had the second highest concentration of projects, for the purposes of this policy, we have excluded Snohomish County in the balance of state definition. Otherwise, we have the unintended consequences of more projects moving just to Snohomish County. So as far as implementation and methodology for this value and outcome, we will compare like projects, develop slightly different scoring criteria and threshold minimums. And our target will be, or our ceiling for this one, geographic balance, we're gonna have a ceiling of 40% of projects located outside of King and Snohomish counties. Next value. Ensuring affordable housing projects serve their purpose for as long as possible and maintaining and preserving existing affordable housing in the portfolio. The outcome is low-income tenants remain in their housing and do not suffer displacement, and that their housing is well maintained and units improved. Trade-off is balancing the needs of the existing portfolio of affordable housing with new construction could result in a decrease in the amount of new construction units. Although we want to prioritize the creation of new construction, financing the acquisition and rehab of existing projects has also been a key purpose of this program over the years. We want to maintain a predictable but limited amount of bond financing to ensure there are resources available for rehabs that address health and safety issues and energy efficiency of the current affordable housing portfolio. We also want to ensure that any financial equity being pulled out of projects as part of a refinancing is being reinvested into the housing to ensure long-term sustainability and livability of the units. We will additionally prioritize the preservations of units with long-term rental assistance. In terms of the methodology, we will compare acquisition rehab projects separately from new construction. We will apply specific criteria for acquisition rehab and target 15 to 25% of the resources for these projects. Next value, using our limited resources efficiently. In terms of promoting the production of housing to serve the most low-income people in Washington as possible, we want to balance cost efficiency with the targets listed above. And we want to ensure projects are maintaining cost efficiency principles and that bond cap is used to support the most cost-efficient projects within the targets listed. We know that different projects in terms of trade-offs at different project types and funding sources, as well as site and other cost factors, impact the amount of units produced, and there may be fewer units produced. Although the types of projects being targeted in the criteria above produce public benefits beyond just the production of units, within these targets, we want to prioritize the most cost-effective projects. We want to continue to seek ways to provide competitive and cost-saving incentives to projects applying for resources. And the methodology for this is still under discussion, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but we're looking at still using points in this category and either looking at comparing like projects or still some comparison to total development cost limits or perhaps a combo of the two. Next slide. So in terms of expressing the values and outcomes and how we implement, we're looking at targets or ceilings for acquisition rehab, projects with public investment, and projects outside King and Snohomish counties. And then in terms of the point ranking, we're looking at the highest points going to by or for people of color and cost efficiency. So we'll have some overarching program targets, but then we'll still have point ranking and criteria within those buckets. And we'll still use point criteria at a much lesser amount than the 24 existing criteria, but we'll focus getting these outcomes in these 5 areas. So I will pause there. Although actually go to the next slide. I think is, yeah, no, let's back up and let me pause there. Any questions so far on the values and outcomes that we're seeking? You can raise your hand or use the chat. Okay. All right, let's go on. So the way we've been doing business is, well, when we were competitive, right? We used to have, you could come in and get your bond cap, and as long as you could close within 60 days, you could get it, right? So then we went to a competitive process where clearly we had more projects than we had bond cap. So we basically had a score and we ranked all different projects in the same list. So everything was competing against everything else. And we created a score and we drew the line where we had bond cap. And as I mentioned, the current process has 24 criteria. And we're looking to streamline that a bit. So that's how we were doing it before. One big list that we ranked based on score. So the new system, next slide. We're looking at having one round in 2022 in early March and giving projects to the end of the year to close. We will look to do an intent to apply so we can get a sense of the lay of the land several months in advance. As I've mentioned, we are going to move some of the criteria to threshold. There'll be some threshold criteria required to apply. We're looking at streamlining the point system, comparing light projects, and managing to targets and ceilings. So meeting floors and ceilings in how we allocate bond cap. Next slide. So here is the flow chart trying to depict how this will all work. So projects will come in, like I said, in 2022, we'll have one round. That way we can get a better sense of the lay of the land. We can give people some time to adjust. And we also want to take into consideration if there are any federal initiatives that take place at the end of the year to give folks a chance to adjust for that. So that's why we're thinking March. Then again, we'd have one round, all the projects would come in, and then you would be either a new production project or an acquisition rehab project. Under new production, you'd either have public leverage or no public leverage. Same thing with acquisition rehab, you'd either have public leverage or no public leverage. From there, in new production public leverage, you'd either be in Seattle, King County, or balance of state. If you have no public leverage, you'd then be between King and Snohomish in a bucket, and then balance of state. Likewise, with acquisition rehab, if you have public leverage, you'll be compared to Seattle King County projects or balance of state. And if you have no public leverage in AC rehab, King Snohomish versus balance of state. So a little nuance there in terms of how the breakouts are geographic, but hopefully you can see in the little maps the difference. Then we create lists in each of those categories. And then next slide. From there, we overlay the targets. Although it's not quite as linear, we would basically manage to the ceilings and try to meet the minimums. So for AC rehab, based on what we have to allocate in a round, we'd figure out what 25% of that acquisition rehab is. We would fill the bucket until we've at least met 15%. We wouldn't over fill the bucket if it meant cutting into new construction to meet balance of state, for example. But then we'd also take a look at public leverage, figure out 60% of the allocation for public leverage, fill the bucket to at least meet 50%, and then balance with also balancing balance of state. So no more than 40% for balance of state, but no minimum floor. And then at the end, what's left ends up going to no public leverage, new production, no public leverage, AC rehab. So lists 3 and 8, after we've met these targets, would then be filled. So I'll pause there because I know this is a lot. So it looks like, Robin, when you have a chance, no public leverage really means none. What of the case where project has county's federal homeward that might be 10% of a TDC? Is that no public leverage or is there a minimum? Yes, so we will have minimum thresholds to be considered public leverage. At this point, 5% of TDC for balance of state, probably more like 10% for Seattle and maybe something like 8% for King County. I'm still working with the public funders to figure out what is the kind of optimal place for public leverage. So no longer will there be leverage points, although there may still be some points for the Evergreen Fund in the non-public leverage bucket. But in terms of either you meet the threshold criteria for being in the public leverage bucket or you don't, and those threshold criteria will be developed. Thank you, Robin. Comments, questions? Should I go back through it another time? Why don't we move back to the first slide of the flowchart? Can points for efficiency be used to make up for no public leverage? Or will all projects without leverage be on the bottom of the list? Yes. Yes. So public leverage projects will be in a list, and we'll then rank that list by cost efficiency, as is non-public leverage deals. They'll be in a list, and we'll rank them by cost efficiency. But no, there's no making up. Where the let's move to the next slide, Sojung. These are the targets that we're trying to hit. And then what's left, which really does turn out to be no public leverage, new construction, and AC rehab, will be what's at the bottom, quote unquote bottom. I mean, we would fill in the remaining projects with what's left after we've met the minimum targets. Other comments, questions? Yes, we will definitely get to that. Now, Momar says we must more clearly define what buy-in for communities of color, the disparities felt in projects by communities of color. Yes, we will get to that later in the presentation, and then only at a high level today, and then we have more work to do on that. So there is no percent left for list 3 or 7. Yes, there is. In our modeling, there was a fifth, basically, approximately, of the resources left for those remaining buckets. There were, because again, we're not going to go over the ceilings. We're going to keep to the ceilings, and if there is more projects, so that there is a remaining. So we're very intentionally trying to leave resources for the non-public leverage deals. Any other questions? What will the process be for adopting these policies? Will there be opportunity for further public comment to commissioners to consider? Yes, I brought these goals and outcomes, values and outcomes were presented yesterday, and there was a clear support from the commissioners of these overarching values and outcomes. But yes, we will talk about next steps, but yeah, this still all has to be approved by the commissioners. Absolutely. But yes, we went through this whole presentation yesterday with them, and yeah, I believe there was support to move forward with these high-level values and outcomes. And again, these are all driven from the concerns and comments that we received in the last few months. And so, you know, again, we're trying to balance for geographic dispersion, public investment, communities of color, all of the different concerns, issues that were raised from the broader stakeholder community, and trying to balance all of those things to still have some predictability and some pathways for the types of projects that we know are out there. Okay. Any other questions about the flow or the outcomes? Or comments? Colin? Can we unmute Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I just now that I'm seeing this for a second time, I just wanted to ask about really it's related to the ceiling. If you're looking at these different lists and ranking projects within those lists, if you hit the ceiling on, say, the balance of state, how will you then rank across some of the different lists to determine which project might not move forward if that ceiling is hit?
Well, we'll do similarly. We'll cut off where we think we've got the resources, right? So we'll kind of figure out 40% of balance of state. 40% of the amount of allocation that we have is approximately, X amount. When we get to X amount, we'll stop. Basically, I mean, yeah, we'll need to keep balancing across each of these, but basically we'll figure out the math going in based on what we have to allocate. We'll roughly know what that amount is, and then we'll, work to get to the minimums and have kind of the framework or boundaries of what that amount would be based on the amount we have to allocate, and 40% per se, right? So we'll have a sense of that. And then, yes, depending upon, and this is why we have different lines on this graph, because some buckets may have way fewer projects and some buckets may have way more. So we'd still have to rank projects if there's too many. And we'll still have a point criteria that ranks those projects, and we'll cut it off at the line in terms of when we filled that bucket.
So if you have, say, 45%, projects that add up to 45% balance of state, and so you've ranked them in the different lists, but then you're also tracking this overall ceiling. But one project might be an AC rehab, one might be a public leverage, and will you be able to have a criteria to evaluate and compare those in the balance of state category?
Well, so we won't over invest in AC rehab to get to balance of state. And if there's a project that puts us over, so if it's like, the last project on the list and it puts us over the ceiling, then we won't allocate to that. So yeah, all of these ceilings, floors, targets kind of balance each other out. And then, yeah, we may have to make a decision of one or more projects at the very end. And it'll basically be, does it fit or does it push it over? And if it pushes it over, then we won't go there. And then again, wanting to ensure that there's remaining dollars for the non-public leveraged deals. And so, yeah, there may need to be some guide rails around kind of those final calls. And I think, again, it'll just be based on, balancing between these targets and what's left over. And then, maybe it's the size of the project and bond cap per unit, which is kind of what we've always used as a tiebreaker.
Right.
So.
Right. Okay, thanks.
I know it's a lot to digest, and it is basically turning things upside down. So, and again, I feel like it's really built on a regrounding and resetting of the outcomes we want to achieve based on all of the comments that we got in these last year and a half, really, since it's gotten so competitive to balance all of these interests. So Robin's asking, would forward commitment still be possible with one round? It seems likely not, giving timing of closings and having bond cap actually in hand to commit. More federal resources make this a moot point, as the bond round itself might have more, right? Like 25 to 28% test would also expand the number of projects feasible. Absolutely. Yeah, bond cap is very different than the 9% allocation. And although we are using a forward commit in this year because of all the competitiveness and kind of we're changing midstream, and for all the reasons we've explained prior, I don't feel comfortable continuing to do forward committing, because we really, we get our bond cap allocation through the state, through the Department of Commerce. There's all these other categories. It's still very not as much in our control as like the 9% allocation. So yeah, I on any given year, we know that we have carry forward, and that there could be remaining cap that would just carry forward. I know right now, currently, we're seeing, between the construction costs and financing teams, we're definitely seeing a delay in closings. And so, often we will have cap that is carry forward, but often that is designated to a project. But that's the only kind of, kind of quote unquote forward commit that we've historically done. And so, yeah, to the extent that we can get back to managing cap within the year we have it, I feel much more comfortable with that. So, yeah. Thanks for the question. All right, well, we'll move on, and we can certainly revisit this, but this is kind of the crux of the process flow and how we're changing things. Yeah, so as far as a scoring tool, the next session, June 3rd, is when we're proposing to put out the thresholds and scoring. So stay tuned. We're still finalizing that. And to that end, here, let's go to the next slide. There's a couple things that, yeah, we can still talk about today to help influence that. So for discussion is sponsor limits. How do people feel about sponsor limits? Currently, our policy allows for up to 50% of an allocation to go to one developer over the course of the year. We've limited that in the last couple of rounds because of how competitive it's been. So we've just limited it to how many projects a sponsor could have. We're thinking about doing a 2-project limit and or 25% of the allocation. So having a mixed policy around sponsor limits. How does that sound? Any comments around that? I guess I should share my positive energy tea with everybody. Yeah, I'm going to get to all of these things. I want to try to kind of walk through them sequentially. Yeah, we're going to get to stuff. The project limits I'm proposing are 2 projects per sponsor and or 25% of the total allocation, whichever is less. Is that right? No more than 25%. Combo deal points. Yeah. So, okay. John's asking about combo deal points, which we can get to. Yes, is it the lower of? Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's a good question, Michelle. Could we modify that based on intents to apply if you receive a sizable number? Meaning, yes, can you speak to that more, Michelle? Like, how, so we would.
I just was, wait.
Yeah, no, you're on.
Okay. I just was thinking that if we, if we were only holding the 1 round in 2022 and we've changed all these things, there's a lot of shifting, right, of things. And I think it's great to have the intents a few months ahead to really get a gauge on what that level of interest is. But I am thinking, to me, just off the cuff, 25% seems pretty high for a limit. And I mean, 2 projects may not be, but as all the costs we're seeing are going up, you know,
Yeah, I guess 25% of what, right? I mean, depending
yeah.
upon, you know, right now we were thinking 500 million was what we were using as kind of the amount.
Mhm.
So it's about 125 million. So,
Okay.
yeah, it's, you know, percentage of what? So that is a good point. When, you know, if it doubles down and we're talking about 1 billion, then yeah, that is a lot. So we probably would look to decrease the percentage if we, you know, ended up with a lowering of the 50% test.
Okay.
So that's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on the sponsor limit piece? John, Fisher, I'm kind of curious. Or David, Radcliffe, do either of you have thoughts on that? I'll take that as a no. Or you can send me your thoughts separately, I guess. If you do. Okay, cost efficiency. We'll move to that if there's no other questions or comments on sponsor limits. Cost efficiency. So I'd like to see us move to a cost per square foot per person. Cost per square foot per person compared within the buckets. So, and then median, figuring out the median, and then you'd get points for being below the median and below. So, John, let's go back to the first flow chart. Thank you. So, Seattle King public leverage list 1, all those projects we take and figure out the square footage per person, figure out the median, and then you get points for median and below. Same thing with King Snohomish, no public leverage. We would then rank those projects basically, maybe up to 5 or 10 points total for cost efficiency points. And then maybe still do a combo of TDC. You know, if we moved to just the comparing projects in the same buckets, we would maybe just move to TDC being a threshold issue and not having points around that. Or, you know, my concern is without, you know, with the lists that only have 1 or 2 projects, do we still need to do some kind of measure, cost efficiency measure against like a TDC limit? And so maybe a combo of those 2 would be where we might land to kind of address what happens if there's only a bucket with 1 project in it. Although if there's only a bucket with 1 project in it, it will, you know, and it's meeting one of these targets, right? It'll most likely be in no matter whether they're getting cost efficiency points or not. Part of the whole point is to still have a way of ranking projects and prioritizing projects in buckets that are overfilled, basically. So thoughts on doing cost points, comparing square foot per person, looking at the median, and then comparing in that bucket. No thoughts. All right, so does this assume the 1.5 people per bedroom and 1 person per studio? I think, Tanya, it was based on the HUD calculation for how many per bedroom, right? Yes. And then Michelle, if you were setting a TDC limit based on square footage per person up front, are you surveying past projects to apply those metrics and setting it there with a cost escalator maybe? So no, we wouldn't be changing the TDC limits. We would be, I mean, the TDC limits, if we, yeah, no, the square footage per person per bedroom is based on just comparing like projects and not the TDC limit. The TDC limit is still more or less going to be what we've been doing. And this is why I am thinking it would be better to do a comparative because, yeah, given kind of the cost issues right now, and I know that there's been higher contingencies and escalators and, you know, the timing of projects now closing, that, yeah, we wouldn't, I wasn't thinking of resetting the TDC limit based on square footage per person. No. And so you're saying, yeah, seems like an either or, right? Uh-huh. Or it could be a combo. We would do 5 points for the comparative one and 5 points for the TDC. And then, yeah, we'd still need to manage for what the TDC is like. And just to be clear, it's square foot per person. But the calc would delete cost of land, offsites, and reserves. Yes, I believe that was the same math. Then take the TDC divided by number of people in a project. Yeah, so Tanya or Dan, do you want to, Dan Rothman, do you want to try to walk through the math? It's total residential square footage. Tanya, why don't you, do you want to just chime in?
Yeah, Lisa, I'm not as close to this exercise, I don't think.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Uh-oh, she can't unmute. Oh, let's see, can we add it? Here we go. We can help you with that, I think. There we go. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Yes. So total residential is in application certified.
Tanya, you're
Square footage.
Yeah, you were a little in and out there. Could you try it again?
Okay, I removed the mic. Can everybody hear me now better?
Yeah.
So we have the total residential square footage. We have the total residential cost. And we also can impute total number of residents served. So the median could be calculated one of the two ways. Dollar per residential square foot or dollar per imputed resident that will be housed in those projects. And the ranking will be done round per round. It's blind comparison. There's no way to predict how much per square foot each project will be aiming at.
So yes, this does. Thank you, Tanya. So this does try to balance larger households, larger bedroom units. You know, again, if we're looking at the buckets and comparing like projects, We may or may not have larger bedrooms depending upon where they are. But yes, this is trying to balance for what we've heard historically has been an issue, which is our TDC limits on larger households, and that we've disadvantaged larger households. And so, yeah, this is trying to balance that. You know, I might say in terms of modeling this, folks that got cost points before would get cost points still, and folks that didn't get cost points in this current framework will not get cost points. So, you know, for the most part, if you were over TDC, then you're going to be over the median, right? So it helps hopefully to balance some of the concern about larger households. It doesn't dramatically change the results. It's just another way of ranking projects and ensuring that there's some attention to costs. Does that make sense? Is everyone following our logic there in terms of the equation, the math at least? Yes, no, maybe? Get a couple of examples sent around. So you want to see the math? Is that what you're suggesting? Show us the math. Okay, yeah, we'll figure out a way to share the math. You could also try to do the math yourselves in terms of how that looks for your own project, in terms of how it compares to DDC. And so, David, you're asking and acknowledging that, right? Costs are crazy right now. And so what is the repercussion of not sticking with a TDC commitment? And you mean on the developer's side or on our side from a policy perspective? Developers, yeah. So, yeah, this is a good question and something that we've continued to struggle with even when we had our TDC limits. You know, people come in with numbers and then the numbers change pretty consistently. For the most part, you know, we haven't seen a huge fluctuation in total. We have seen fluctuations by developer, and we've tried to address that, call that out, speak to that when we see that. We were talking about maybe you can get extra points in further rounds if you actually are on track. But that, of course, might mean you would inflate your budgets. So, yeah, I think it's a point in time. And so we would do the best we can at point in time, and then we'll do the best we can to analyze what are the significant changes from application to placed in service or cost cert. And then, yeah, we could either do something that's a positive reinforcement, or we could do something that's negative, or we could just acknowledge that, you know, on any given day or any given round, there are variables outside of our control, and that hopefully folks are making a good faith effort to give us the best numbers they can. And, you know, like I said, now I know that contingencies, people are putting in higher contingencies, people have been putting in market fluctuation. So I, you know, again, if we compare projects to each other, you know, assuming everybody's kind of doing something similar, or we get to some best practice standard that you are allowed a certain amount of contingency. Yeah, I think there's some ways we could mitigate this, but I'm open for suggestion on the best approach. It's pretty hard. I know, you know, yeah. And some people are, you know, really good at it and some people aren't. So yeah, TDC would still be a threshold. We'd still probably have some, yeah, if we move to just a straight comparative point system, then we would move to TDC as a threshold. We would have some potential boosters for extenuating circumstances, one being large households. We'd still probably have some level of a waiver process, although maybe not just open-ended waiver. So yeah, I think if we do some combo of the TDC points, so 5 and 5, 5 is tagged to TDC and 5 is tagged to comparison, then we wouldn't have it as a threshold. So yeah, there's a couple different ways to approach this, which we're still debating. Yeah, at this point, David, I think, we're acknowledging that there's clearly a market issue right now. And yeah, we weren't going to do anything specifically with the projects in this pool, this current year's allocation, other than track how people are doing and how they're going to fill gaps. And yeah, I mean, we're just trying to troubleshoot as we go these existing deals. And then, yes, everything I'm talking about is for the future for 2022 and beyond. Tricky stuff, huh? Nothing's easy, nothing's straightforward, but I still think we want to use this as a way of prioritizing projects. Like I said, especially in yeah, in buckets where we've got a lot of deals. So David, can you say more about what you just put in there about the 55%? You cannot have more than 9% eligible basis increase. So you're saying that would be a limiting factor or something in and of itself?
Well, it already is, right? You can't compensate for more than 10% in overruns because there's not enough bonds pursuant to the 55% threshold on 50% limit. So just outlining that's the maximum you could help with overruns, but I guess there's significant losses coming down our pipeline of projects under construction. How is the commission going to underwrite whether or not a sponsor has the ability to fill a $20+ million gap in project financing?
So say I got the second part, but the first, your assumption is that this is going to continue. Is that my hope is that it's not going to continue. And, I guess these are exactly the issues we have now, right? Like, yeah, that's, we can't assure that, right? And, once we commit to a project for the most part, I mean, there are certain considerations. I mean, if there's really a gap that can't be filled, maybe the bond cap has to be returned, or maybe we have to issue more cap. I mean, I think these are all kind of the concerns we're going to have to outline now, as we're in this big cost mess. Like, yeah, how far are we willing to go with the existing projects in the pipeline is a good question. But yeah, clearly there's some room by doing a 55% test. Will people, allow 53 or yeah, can you, there's obviously a few different tools we have to try to mitigate. And then at a certain point, you're right. If the gaps are too big, we may not be able to move forward with some of these projects. And then, yeah, we've been somewhat responsive, flexible with additional cap, but I think if everyone's asking for additional cap, then that kind of is a little bit much. And I think we would limit, we've been talking internally about what's the criteria, what's the limit. So yes, we are clearly aware of what's going on, and we'll need to come up with a process to be fair across the board on projects that are in the pipeline and trying to close. Yeah. So yeah, Tanya, why don't you go ahead and share your screen? We can try to show folks some of the math. You know, I don't really want to get too into the weeds. What's our time here? 2:30. So let's just do a quick, we can do a quick show, and then I want to move on. I don't want people tripped up on the math. It's more conceptually that I'm looking for, you know, engagement, not necessarily the math itself. But yeah, if it helps to see the math, I would love to. So what we did was 4 different calculations. We looked at square foot, dollar per square foot, dollar per resident, square foot per resident. So square foot, dollar per square foot per resident, bond cap per square foot, bond cap per resident. And, you know, these are all projects that we're obviously not showing you, but these are from basically this last round. The median is here. And then projects that are below the median would get points. Projects above the median would not get points. And so you can kind of see the color coding throughout like the whole different process of how it affects projects. And some projects it affects differently, but for the most part, you know, like this particular project, it makes a big difference for. But this project, it really doesn't. And this project, it really doesn't. And as you can imagine, you know, some of these projects got points before and some didn't, and it's pretty much the same. It's just a way of comparing amongst similar projects. And this is grouping the projects like we have that like we're suggesting. So this was modeling all of these different buckets and trying to compare like projects. So yeah, green would be good. Red would be bad. Green is go. Red is stop.
Green would be the percentage below the median in that bucket. So some projects were really cost efficient.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that all the ones that are green, well, at least all the ones that are red did not get cost efficiency points. In other words, these calculations really don't change much from the existing scheme.
But, you know, we didn't have, yeah, and we had a mix. We had a mix of bedroom sizes and a mix of units. And again, what this does differently is compares like projects. So unlike what we did before, there was no comparing of like projects. It was just the TDC limits, right?
Right.
But now, yeah, so there wasn't much of a change, and it's still comparing like projects, which is the big difference. So
yes, absolutely.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. All right. So if there's no more comments on this, and hopefully that helps people get a sense of it better. And, you know, I can think about for the next meeting how we depict that a little simpler. But you know, I guess I just want to reiterate that we've been doing a lot of modeling and we've got a lot of spreadsheets behind the scene, and we were trying to really boil that all down. So the calculation, we would be doing the calculation. So you wouldn't so this is basically a blind points, right? So you would give us your square footage, right? We get residential square footage, and we would impute the people served, and we would put all the lists together, compare the like projects, and come out with the median. So yeah, as far as the application, I mean, I guess we could have it on the application to do the math. That might be helpful, or we would just do the math once we get all the applications. I mean, we could figure out yours, but then we still would have to figure out comparatively what's the median and then what the points are based on that, whether you're above or below it. So these would be blind points, which would be different. Okay, any other comments on that? I'll transition to. Yeah, Robin's just commenting on how the math could be could be embedded potentially, yeah. So Megan, I'm not sure I'm following, but yeah, you can only calculate your own. You can't calculate others, right? So you can't really see how it compares to others. We do that math on the 9% program once we get all the applications in. That's our own spreadsheet internally. So if I'm understanding this correctly, David, you think this will drive increased bedroom count but reduced unit sizes? Our intent is not to do that. So if that's what you think is going to happen by doing that, I want to talk more about that. But maybe this gets back to how many points is it? And yeah, this was similar to another comment, Emily saying, yeah. So yeah, I you know, again, hopefully folks are developing projects that meet the community needs. And then we're trying to balance for how those community needs may impact cost. But yeah, unit square foot size might be a blind spot for us. So yeah, I appreciate people's thoughts on this. If we're looking for a way to drive ranking through cost efficiency, is there a better way? And that's what we were thinking this was. We can stick to a TDC limit and points around the TDC limit. But that wasn't perfect. Like nothing's perfect, right? Nothing's perfect in any of this. And so we were trying to balance for larger bedroom projects, and really focused on the outcome of people, like how many people we're serving. But if that's going to drive decisions about types of projects as opposed to meeting the community's needs, then yeah, and again, we were trying to drive to a comparison of like projects. So yeah. So Michelle's saying there's still a concept of livability in building code. So yeah, at this point, it would be helpful to have more of a discussion. About this, because I think it's, yeah, Michelle, do you want to comment more on your?
Yeah, I was just responding to the idea that people would artificially, like, all of a sudden start creating lots and lots of tiny little bedrooms. I don't honestly see that as reasonable or feasible. I mean, there's still the concept of livability in these units. If you're going to stick a bunch of families in there, they got to be able to, like, live in those units and those bedrooms. And so I don't see that as creating marketable projects. I mean, you probably would have a lot of difficulty doing that. And then there's also the concept of building codes have minimum bedroom sizes, I think. If they don't, they should. So, I mean, I think I like where this is going, because I think it is responding to a very clearly unmet need in some markets. And you know, you're doing the best you can with that. And so hopefully it will yield the result that we're trying for.
Yeah, and I think this was what was, you know, important for us to model, like, how does it impact, you know, and again, there wasn't a big impact to how, like, the ranking played out. So, and it seemed like it adjusted for some of the concerns that we've been hearing. And then Robin, yeah, did you want to add your thoughts on the TDC limit issue and how that's not perfect?
I was just saying that the TDC limits are familiar to us all. So there's comfort there, except that I think there's a lot of debate every year over whether the county is included in various buckets and the escalation factors applied are fair or not. So I think any way you try to improve this has some pain. But I think it's like a beta test. I think it might be interesting to try. Maybe one thing to think about is, well, what is the proportional impact of the number of points given if you're below the median? If we're all quibbling about 1 or 2 points, even though bond score is very tight, I understand that it distinguishes you getting above the line or not, so-called the line. But what is the impact? I don't know yet. I don't think that's been determined, how many points that position compared to the median will get you. So maybe that will help clarify.
Yeah, and I think we were still thinking of this category in general being 10 points. But then is the comparable 5 and the TDC, like if we did a combo of the two, is comparable 5 points and TDC 5 points, so that maybe that helps to kind of balance things, and then it addresses the buckets and where we only have a few projects. Yeah, it is different, and there is a comfort zone. So I think that's part of what we need to try to gauge, how much is change and people's discomfort with change versus just, you know, trying it and seeing and using it as a pilot to see how it goes. And we can always circle back if it seems like it's not working. And so, David, did you want to chime in with your voice?
Sure. Lisa, as you know, we're not developing in Seattle, where we're out in the suburbs, and frankly, deliver very large units because we think that benefits our tenants.
Right.
If you have 100% spread to market rents in Seattle, you're going to end up with CDUs, counting as studios. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking through all the unintended consequences of this shift. I think it will drive unit sizes down across the board.
Okay. Robin.
I was wondering if Becky Bicknell is on the call still, because we've pursued a very efficient unit size, and Our experience, David, has been the opposite, where the more efficient the unit, the higher the per square foot cost goes, though the lower the per unit cost goes. And I wish I understood it better than I do, but I think it has something to do with the cheaper forms, the cheaper scopes in a larger unit net you a larger per square foot cost. And it's the opposite in smaller units. So I don't know if your statement would prove out that very small units will have lower per square foot costs, because the expensive stuff still needs to be in the small unit, like kitchens and bathrooms. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I want to pivot because now I'm realizing we are going to get short on time here, and the buy-in for is obviously an important conversation. So I appreciate all the dialogue on this topic, and we'll go back. It's really helpful to get this input, so we will take this all under consideration and come back out with something next week for you all.
I just unmuted David. Can we do one last comment?
Robin, I agree with your math, but I still think it's, you know, regardless of increasing the per square foot cost, if you reduce the unit size, I think that, you know, that's still going to be a net benefit under this scoring regime. So all good. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of buy-in for, again, we have some very high level categories. We still need to do some work on defining and implementation, but I wanted to at least put out the high level thinking that we have right now in terms of the points. We're thinking 20 points for development buy-in for the community in 4 categories. Ownership entity is more than 50% BIPOC owned. Development will be owned long-term by a community-based organization. The development entity or partnership has history in the community, and the development entity engages in a meaningful community participation and decision input process. So again, I'm not prepared to really go into detail about how you would meet this criteria or what the threshold requirements will be or how we will determine it, but we're working on that. And that's really what the next June 3rd, I'll put in a plug for June 3rd, is when we wanted to talk much more and go into more depth about the threshold and the points. Today, I really wanted to at least get out the framework of the targets, the outcomes, values, and have a little bit of discussion about this. But yeah, we'll get into more detail on this. But again, so ownership entity is more than 50% BIPOC owned. Development will be owned long-term by a community-based organization. Development entity or partnership has history in the community, and the development entity engages in a meaningful community participation and decision input process. So this would be the main category of points at like 20 points. We'd still have a handful of other points, but between this at 20 points and cost efficiency at 10 points, and then we'd have some additional categories, probably more like in the 5-point range. And to get back to the combo, yeah, we may do that as points. We may do that as a automatic. We haven't really talked through how that would work yet, but yes, we would still try to prioritize combo deals, meaning if you have a 9%, if you were successful in a 9% award, that would help bump you in the bond program. So yeah, we're still thinking of ways to consider those a priority. So again, I know there's a lot to still unpack with these categories in terms of what they mean and how you meet them. But I did want to give folks a chance to at least get a sense of what those categories are looking like. And again, you know, there'd be a continuum of points that you could get. You may not get all of them, but you could still get some of them depending upon, you know, where and who you may be partnering with, or the community you're developing in, or you as the organization. So trying to, again, be responsive to some of the community outreach we did in terms of what's important in the BIPOC community, and to start to prioritize buy-in for. Any comments or questions on that piece? We did an initial survey to try to figure out the priorities. And then, like I said, we're going to be doing some ongoing work to figure out the criteria. It may take us a little longer than next week to come up with all the criteria, but again, I wanted to at least provide the framework, as I know timing is of the essence and is sensitive, so that folks can get a sense of the direction we're headed. And then as far as the PDAs and Sound Transit, we are still in conversation with the PDAs, the public development authorities, just a couple of them in Seattle that are active. And then Sound Transit, we've been also talking to Sound Transit. We know that they have several large RFPs coming up in the next year or so. And we've been talking about, is there a way to allocate resources up front to those Sound Transit properties? And Bill is asked to repeat that framework one more time. Happy to do that. The 4 categories we're looking at is ownership entity is more than 50% BIPOC owned, that the development will be owned long-term by a community-based organization, that the development entity or partnership has history in the community, and that the development entity engages in a meaningful community participation and decision making process or input process. So looking at ownership up front in terms of the development, but then also the 15-year. So the owned long-term is the kind of the 15-year piece. Does the development entity, or is there a partner that has history in the community? And then what kind of engagement have you done in that community for the project? Are kind of the 4 main areas. So Michelle, you're saying you'd like to see the timing of the owned by a community-based entity be upfront rather than just at year 15. It's both. So it's the first one is that you own it or have 51% ownership. And then the second one is that you also either, a BIPOC organization that's going to own the entity will also get the 15 years, but you could get the 15 years if you don't have 51%. So if you're at 49% potentially, so you can't get the first 5 points, then you can certainly get the second 5 points by owning in at year 15. So that's the intent, is to have this continuum, knowing that the community, the investment community, the lending community may not be quite there yet. So starting to allow for options that the financing community still can support. So trying to balance the issues of our policy, being still consistent with getting financing. So yes, those are 2 different criteria. Absolutely. Yep. So you could get both. And that's our goal, is that, if you get 20 points, then you're doing all of the above, basically. But that there is places where you can fit in if you can't get to all of the above. So, yeah. Any questions or comments on the Sound Transit or PDAs? That's just something I wanted to maintain on the table, just to let folks know that that's still in discussion. And that's, mostly a public funder conversation, actually, for the most part at this point. Yeah, we're definitely talking about general partner tier sponsor relationships. Yep. Great. My next slide was really about next steps. We've got another meeting scheduled for June 3rd, which again, I will focus more on how we're changing some of the points to thresholds and what points we still have. And then June 10th, we'll focus more on the new acquisition rehab policies. I definitely want to do a public comment period. And so that can start now with email, but then we will probably put out a survey that second week in June. And then with any luck at all, I go back to the commission in July with kind of this full package. Although there still may be pieces that we need to flesh out. I'm trying to hold to getting this framework in place as soon as possible so folks know the lay of the land. Emily.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate this. Having heard it now the second time, it's all starting to come together. I just have a question for you. You mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation that, you know, these changes may result in fewer units, but will result in the outcomes, the more clear outcomes that we've said we wanted, which I think is good. I think having that clarity of what we're trying to find at the end is important. But I know you guys have been running a lot of numbers. I know you have a lot of data people on your staff. And I know you guys have a lot of data from the last 2 years on the cost of these publicly financed units or deals with public leverage in them and the cost and the units that do not. You know, have you guys run some sensitivity analysis on the real number, because it's not May, right? I think my opinion is that it will be fewer units. And if you guys run sensitivity analysis on how many fewer units you expect to be produced next year or in 2023 with these changes and the prioritization of the deals with public leverage or public value?
What we have done, and we've talked about, I knew this would come up, and I knew you would actually ask this question. So I still need to do another round, but the first round that we've done shows bond cap per unit being reduced. And so that this would be more efficient overall in terms of bond cap per unit, but that doesn't address your issue, which is how many units are produced. But it would be a more efficient use of bond cap, as it turns out. So again, a lot will depend on what's balance of state, right? Like, are we getting balance of state deals? You know, balance of state deals end up being fairly efficient because they're smaller, they're using less cap, they're, you know, so when we modeled adding in more balance of state, because of course this last round we really didn't have many balance of state. So when we went back and tried to pull in over the years balance of state, you know, we're still, it actually shows more efficient use of bond cap in this model. But we haven't done the math for the units. So we'll work on that. We'll work on that because I think it would be good to say, right, what is the potential differential?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. And of course, you know, all the modeling in the world, you know, is only as good as it is, as we all know, right? We can all model and do the best we think we can with the information that we have. And then it all really depends upon what's going on in the world. So, but I appreciate that, you know, we've been trying really hard to figure out like the different scenarios and modeling so that we can have a sense of what the impacts will be, but we really won't know until we try. So that's, you know, and it may take some time, right, to meet these targets. And yeah, so I think that's the other piece, you know, how feasible is it to do balance of state? How much capacity do we have in the BIPOC community? How much partnering do we see? You know, there's a lot of questions still to be answered in terms of how, like you say, some of these policies may drive decision making. So I think, you know, that could still be several years out before we really see that change, given that you all have projects in the pipeline, right? So I think that's still a pretty big unknown. And then, yeah, do we get additional resources? Does interest rates change? Yeah, like there's still a lot of potential barriers to how, or challenges or variables to how this all plays out. But join me next week to dive a little deeper. thank you so much for all your time. We've been hard at work trying to hammer out this so that folks have a sense of it all. And I appreciate your support and patience and look forward to hearing from folks. I'm happy to run through this, either in small groups or one-on-one, because I know it's a lot to digest. But yeah, so happy to do whatever I can to help folks understand this and to get some good input so that folks all have a chance to understand where we're headed and help us define some of these harder criteria. Thank you all very much.